Paul says that the Colossians heard the gospel from a man named Epaphras. Many theologians believe that Epaphras could have been like the church planter or the founding pastor of this church community. We don't know that for sure. If anything, he's probably at least a founding leader and for sure like a notable leader, because otherwise they wouldn't have put his name in a letter like this. When they would send letters like this, they would gather together and read them. And so when he's just going to like say a name without any context, it's like they know who Epaphras is. Epaphras knows Paul now, probably through some sort of ministry interaction. Some people think maybe he wandered over to Ephesus at some point where Paul was there. But at this point, we gain from the letter that Paul has not even actually been to Colossae yet. He's just strictly writing off this report that he's received. But notice, Paul doesn't say, like, Epaphras has shared a list of amazing programs and statistics and efforts that you're all doing, so I'm praising God for the work that you're doing. No. Paul says that he's thankful, in verse 6, that the gospel is bearing fruit and growing throughout the whole world, just as it has been doing among you since the day you heard it and truly understood God's grace. This is not a people-centered thankfulness. This is a gospel-centered thankfulness. He doesn't praise them for being great doers and having great programs and busy, productive things that we often judge and measure churches' success by. But instead, he says the gospel is bearing fruit. And because of that, I celebrate. I'm excited about what God is doing in your midst. And it's too easy to fall into arbitrary statistics and measurements of like what success is in this world of church. It's too easy to get wrapped up in attendance, production, and other surface level things that we judge churches by. And I'm not saying that those matter. They do. There's really important things that we can draw from them. But most of the time, like we make those kinds of metrics like priority number 1, 2, and 3, rather than maybe like 5, 6, and 7. That there's probably some other gauges of success that we could measure before we start looking at some of these arbitrary surface level things that we often judge a community by. But when you start to do what Paul does here, and you begin to consider how the gospel is working within a community, you find reason to praise regardless of how big you are, regardless of how influential and how powerful you are, because all of a sudden you're starting to reflect on testimonies. You're going to say, that person over there, like we met them at this environment and they were totally into this and we got to share the gospel with them. They've been in our community since, and it's just been absolutely incredible. You get to celebrate people overcoming sin. You get to be in a small group where people are confessing and talking about difficult things, and you're seeing like growth and change, and you're seeing just the gospel at work within people. It's a special, special thing. When we step back from some of these arbitrary things and we start to say, how is the gospel working in our midst? All of a sudden you're like, there are countless reasons to celebrate, to be thankful, to praise God for what he's doing. It's no secret that the pandemic really did a number on like the global church's attendance. If you look, most churches, even really big churches, have on average recovered to about 1/3 of the size that they were pre-pandemic. And that's not the case for every community. There certainly are some that have maintained throughout or have kind of caught back up since. But statistically, some of the best experts have gone out and said, no, it looks like the average church is about 1/3 of what they were compared to 3 years ago. And if we're going to judge the global church based off of attendance, we have some really negative news to reflect on here. That's not going to be a happy conversation for us. But I think we could all step back and say, no, I think God's been working and doing some amazing things, even though the church doesn't look as mighty as maybe it felt and looked like 3 years ago. Like God's still been doing incredible things in our midst. We can still recount things he did through our church and through that church across town and that church I used to be connected with in another city. It's like just because attendance is down, it doesn't mean that the church has just like ceased to exist and operate and function. God has been doing something, and there's reason to celebrate. And this trend is truly the case throughout all of history. You can look back different centuries and different eras. Things are always up and down. There's times where the church has a ton of prominence. They've got a lot of social influence and power. It's like the norm to be a Christian. It's the norm to be about Christian values. And then there's times where it seems like the church has just dwindled down to nothing and it's hanging on by a thread. But the truth is, God works when the church is at its largest, and he works when it's small and filled with potential and faith. So do I celebrate influential churches and the work that they do? Absolutely. There are some communities, churches are like the biggest provider of social needs or care for issues in a city. There are churches big enough that like if they were to disappear, like whole communities would go into poverty. People that have access to certain resources would have nowhere to go or would get backed up in government processes. There are churches that essential to communities, and I'm so thankful that they exist and so thankful for what they do. But I never neglect to look down on what God is doing in the quieter, more subtle movements within his people too. Oftentimes, you look back, if you study revivals and you study all these different moments throughout history, it was in small prayer gatherings, small worship services that huge things were birthed out of. According to Paul, we can have thanksgiving because regardless of how things might look or feel on the surface through the lens of however we want to culturally judge a church context, if God is moving and the gospel is growing, then it's reason to celebrate. It's reason to praise God and thank him for what he's doing.
Hey, thanks for checking out our YouTube video today. We appreciate you taking the time to tune in with us. Before you take off, please hit the like button. And if you want more of this content and you want to be notified when we put out new videos, hit the subscribe button and the little bell for notifications right next to it. We'll look forward to seeing you next time.